Good afternoon. On behalf of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, I am pleased to welcome you to this very timely program on immigration and refugees. When Ted Kennedy first entered the United States Senate in 1961, he asked to be on the Immigration Subcommittee. He quickly became chair of that committee and transformed what had been a rather sleepy group into a beehive of activity. The first piece of legislation he managed on the floor of the Senate was the Immigration Act of 1965, which phased out the national origin quota system and gave priority to needed skills and family reunification. And as chair of the committee, he also focused on the plight of refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons around the world. Throughout his career, his immigration work was grounded in the belief that immigrants should be afforded civil rights, that refugees should be treated with dignity and respect, and that we should recognize the important economic benefit that our nation reaps from the talents, skills, and determination of immigrants. We're joined today by two outstanding individuals who have worked tirelessly to help immigrants, refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers around the world. Our first panelist is J.C. Hendrickson, Senior Director for Refugee and Asylum Policy at the International Rescue Committee. Mr. Hendrickson leads US-based refugee resettlement and asylum policy and advocacy at IRC, and has been in the forefront of urging a change in US border policy and in speeding up by redesigning Afghan resettlement policy. Our second panelist is Dr. Carolina Jimenez Sandoval, President of the Washington Office on Latin America, where she brings over 20 years of experience in research and advocacy for human rights in the Americas and throughout the world. That work includes documenting and developing strategies to counteract human rights violations in the Americas, to addressing grave crimes under international law in Venezuela and Nicaragua, to promoting the rights of migrants and refugees in Central America, Mexico, and the United States. She is a frequent contributor to media outlets and publications across Latin America and the US. I'm now honored to introduce our moderator for today's conversation, Marcelo Suarez Orozco, Chancellor of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and board member of the Kennedy Institute. Dr. Suarez Orozco himself, an immigrant from Argentina, is a leader in immigration policy. He approaches this issue as a research scholar and a past director of immigration institutes at both Harvard and NYU. He is currently a papal advisor on the topic. I could go on, but I know you want to hear from this extraordinary panel. It is now my great pleasure to turn it over to Chancellor Suarez Orozco to start the program. Thank you all so much for being here.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mrs. Kennedy, for your kind introduction, and thank you for your leadership of the very, very important Edward M. Kennedy Institute. I am so delighted to join you this afternoon and to join with two eminent voices in the current immigration and refugee landscape. It is fair to say that in Boston, in the Commonwealth, indeed in our country, immigration is at once history and destiny. It is a story of how our city, our Commonwealth, our country came to be in its present form. Other than our native communities, all of us are immigrants. Some of us are involuntary immigrants. Some of us are voluntary immigrants. History of immigration fundamentally is the history of the making of the United States. We are so delighted to be a part of this conversation this afternoon. It is important to note that for about almost a century now, the patterns of immigration have had a distinct cartography. We can talk, broadly speaking, about three fundamental formations. First, the movement to establish labor migration as a fundamental piece of the US socioeconomic and political strategy in the context of prior to the war, the Second World War, and during and after the war. We can think in terms of migration being shaped by labor concerns and considerations to a dynamic that became part of what Senator Kennedy was so significantly involved, and that is the rise of the idea of the family conceptually, philosophically, ethically, as the main vector of immigration. So we can say that we moved from a pre-war movement for labor migration to family reunification as the most important axis for the movements of people, to the reality that the rise of the second generation would become a fundamental force transforming our economy and society. Those three chapters are the foundational chapters of the current dynamics, as well as the current changes of mass migration. Today, we will talk about the new drivers of migration, including forced migrations. We will reflect upon how war and terror, and very importantly, unchecked climate change have become very, very powerful drivers of new migrations. We would also reflect upon the new dynamics that are unfolding in the context of a new series of dynamics at the United States southern border, and how what is unfolding at the southern border in a way mimics, in a way it tells the story of what is going on in so many parts of the world today. What we're seeing with the current situation with Afghan refugees and resettlement, a topic we will consider, to the dynamics at the southern border as we see new waves of Haitian migrants following a path that is very, very different from the historic paths of immigrants coming into our country from the southern border. To, of course, the dramatic changes unfolding in the nature of immigration into our country from Latin America. Today, Venezuelans are leading as the most significant, as the most important group of new immigrants coming to our country, with Guatemalans and Honduras closely following. So I want to turn it now to Carolina, our colleague from the Washington office in Latin America, to explore with us how the situation has changed at the US southern border. What's the Washington office of Latin America and the current administration, what are your priorities in terms of informing the current administration on matters pertinent to the border, what you very eloquently in your writings and in your presentations call border management, as well as the pathways that need to be established. So Carolina, I'll turn it over to you. What's going on at the border is not new. Can you help us understand the history of what is happening in the southern border today and how that dynamic is also changing?
Thank you, Marcelo. I think you have provided an excellent overview that will hopefully allow me to speak about a few points that, WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, would like to highlight. But let me first thank the Kennedy Institute of the United States Senate for this invitation. I think now, perhaps more than ever, we need to discuss more and more about migration because the changes that we have witnessed in the last few years actually imply that we need to talk about the new strategies we need to discuss for the new realities. So one thing that we need to discuss about the southern border is that although many policymakers and also the American public reacts to what some consider a border crisis, is not actually a problem at the border. What I mean to say is that migration doesn't start there. Migration starts in communities of origins, in countries that are not too far away, like Mexico, for example, or even Central America, or in countries that are much, much farther. If we talk about the Western Hemisphere, like Brazil or Chile. And what we are witnessing here is a change in the patterns of migration reaching the southern border, of course, to enter the United States. But having a clear vision about what the driving factors are could truly inform policies that are respectful of human rights and that also take into consideration the US needs. So let's have this very clearly. Migration doesn't start at the US border. Migration starts in communities of origins and in transit countries. And what we're witnessing these days is a very important human phenomenon that is not domestic, which is how sometimes policymakers tend to be this issue. Is a transnational human phenomenon that requires transnational solutions. Otherwise, we fail when we focus on a just domestic response towards migration. We were encouraged by the Biden's administration strategies at the beginning, of his presidency, because it was a strategy that included an analysis and a response around root causes. And this is important because there is no way to manage or to create a system of safe and orderly migration if you don't address the driving factors. And as you were saying, we have seen what we call push factors change over time. And of course, if we look at Central America, we're looking at generalized violence, poverty, exclusion, etc. But nowadays, climate change has taken, I think, into a new meaning for the region. And that in the middle of a pandemic, when I'm talking about January and February this year, we saw what we call migrant caravans. I mean, large numbers of people migrating in groups. In Mexico, trying to cross from Guatemala to Mexico was the direct result of 2 devastating hurricanes, right? So if we don't take into account forced displacement due to climate change in the next years to come, I think we will be missing the bigger picture. So that's one piece of analysis that needs to be in our thinking. The second aspect that I would like to highlight, and that addresses your question about what is changing, what realities we are seeing at the border, is that the demographics are changing and the nationalities are changing. So again, policymakers and perhaps public opinion tend to be very focused on the Central Americans and the Mexican migrants, which is still a very important, of course, part of the nationalities that comprise the migration flow. But in the last few months, we're seeing Haitians, Venezuelans, Ecuadorians, and Nicaraguans, reaching the southern borders in numbers that we necessarily didn't see before. Many of these people and many of the Central Americans and the Mexicans crossing the border are people in need of international protection. And why do we say this? We say this because the push factors, especially according to Inter-American human rights standards, imply that this goes beyond pure and traditional economic migration, I'm sorry, to seeing people who are fleeing targeted violence, persecution, and in the case of Venezuela, a humanitarian emergency. So the US is obliged to look at this new reality. The Western Hemisphere is living a historic moment in human mobility. On the one side, Venezuela has expelled 5.7 million people, mostly in the last 5 or 6 years. If, again, we take Inter-American human rights standards, we are talking about people in need of international protection. Therefore, people who should receive refugee status in those countries where they are going. This means that the Western Hemisphere hosts the second largest refugee crisis in the world. And we rarely stop to see that. I mean, what does that mean for our region? We think of refugees when we think about Syria, and other countries that are far away from the Americas. But the truth is that the Venezuelan humanitarian crisis has created the second largest displacement, forced displacement of people, and that has consequences for the entire region. Haiti is again, pretty much in the picture. I think it's hard to find the right word, but I think the pictures we saw in September at the US border are the photograph of migrants being abused by CBP agents is going to remain in our minds for a very, very long time. And what this implies is that clearly the system to manage migration is not one of protection, but is one of enforcement. And we need to move away from what's being established by different countries, not just the US, which is a regional system of enforcement, to a humane regional system of protection. And I have said this in different venues. I think it is difficult to coordinate. You need a lot of officials from different countries involved in thinking about what systems need to be established. But what we have found, sadly, in the region is that when it comes to enforcement, countries cooperate efficiently, with high speed even, and they agree on militarizing border, on deterrence as a way to stop migration, etc. When it comes to cooperating or collaborating on protection, then it is much more difficult. The bureaucracy is much slower, and few times we see the implementation, of policies and practices that protect people who are either asylum seekers or migrants in a situation of vulnerability. So I think it would be very important to see, what the US government could do with this changing reality of having different nationalities coming to the US border, but also having a different demographics, right? Having an increased number of unaccompanied migrant children and families, instead of the more traditional single men crossing into the border and trying to reach the United States. And this change implies that the US government needs to build the infrastructure to assist both families and migrant children who are now coming into the US in greater numbers. What is clear is that the infrastructure is very weak, and I think the US Congress has a very important role to play when it comes to increasing funding, to build this infrastructure. Everything from, more civil processing capacity or immigration courts, asylum officers, etc., to providing, support to, for example, instead of providing funding for detention, it could be also providing or increasing funds for alternatives to detentions. So there are things the government, and in this case, Congress, could do to support more humane policies, before, it reaches perhaps a broader and also very important goal, which is reforming what we all know is a broken immigration system. So things can be done in a rights respecting framework could be implemented, but we need less rhetoric and more action. I think the Biden administration's narrative around migration, of course, is very different from what we witnessed in the previous administration, but we need to move from good intentions into practice. And practice these days is that Title 42 remains, is that many people who come to the border are immediately either pushed back to Mexico or deported, without due process, and abuses, by CBP or other agents continue to be the norm. We saw one picture, but this is a reality that happens across the border and against many migrants and asylum seekers. And without accountability, we would see situations like this repeated.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Carolina, so much. I think that the picture of border agents charging in their horses, Haitian seekers, will live in our neocortex for years to come. Thank you. I think you, in a very pithy way, really gave life to the three dynamics that are now the main drivers of the new migrations in the 21st century. Unchecked climate change, we see Exhibit A, the Northern Triangle. You look at Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, a pattern of droughts, a pattern of dystopic land holding and land tenure that is pushing greater and greater numbers of farmers off their lands. That's one very, very powerful and clear dynamic. War on terror remains a constant. We'll turn now to Afghanistan next. And of course, kleptocratic, rachitic regimes that are just unable to manage the institutions of society that provide the structures and the strictures to conduct life in a flourishing sense. What we see in our border and what we see in countries near in the Americas is, of course, part of this much, much larger dynamic. Syria's Exhibit A. Syria is in the midst of the most significant drought, according to NASA data, in over 900 years. And of course, incompetence, war and terror, and very, very rachitic and unstable regimes pushed over 1 million refugees into the European landmass. JC, of course, the IRC is iconic. It's been at the forefront of so many of these dynamics. Tell us what the IRC is currently doing in the context of the current Afghan refugee crisis. There's a general algorithm here which we can put into place. A decade after US intervention in a region of the world, you have 1 million, 2 million immigrants and refugees from that part of the world in our country. This is what happened after the Vietnam intervention. This is what happened after the various Central American dirty wars of the 1970s, 80s. What is the IRC doing specifically in the current Afghan refugee crisis? Explain to us the difference between asylum seeking, refugees. Explain to us what the resettlement process looks like for our Afghan partners today, and what can be done? What is the IRC doing? What would you like our audience to be doing moving forward as the Taliban tightens its grip on power in Afghanistan?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Chancellor, and it's good to be with you here today. So the IRC is involved across what we call the arc of crisis in many areas, but in particular in Afghanistan. We have over 1,000 staff who are on the ground in Afghanistan, working every day to try to deliver assistance to people in need. And in Afghanistan, there are a lot of people in need. There are 18.4 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan, which is about half the country. And this year alone, we've seen more than 500,000 people internally displaced in Afghanistan. So this type of a crisis warrants an extraordinary response by the international community, by regional neighbors. But we are on the ground doing our part to help in the country. We are also involved in refugee resettlement in the United States. And what that looks like is we are one of the 9 resettlement agencies in the United States who works with the federal government to welcome refugees to America. Each year, the president sets an annual refugee admissions goal. And I'm happy to be able to announce today that on Friday, President Biden set a refugee admissions goal for the next fiscal year of 125,000 people, which was a commitment he made on the campaign trail and earlier in his administration. And we were happy to see realized. But what that goal sets is the total amount of refugees that will be admitted to the United States over the course of the year. And we, as one of the resettlement agencies, help to ensure that people are set up for success once they arrive, that they find a place to live, that they are find a place to work, that they have language access, internet access, and things of that nature. So that engagement, when it comes to Afghanistan and the events of the summer, has taken a whole new shape and a whole different sense of urgency. Over the last several weeks to now months, tens of thousands of Afghans left the country on an emergency basis. Many on military flights to bases abroad. And we are partnering with the United States here to ensure that Afghans in particular, as part of this large movement, are set up with refugee resettlement services in the United States. So our involvement in Afghanistan it starts in Afghanistan, and it finishes here in the United States, where we are helping to Afghan Americans now to get set up and start a new life here. Now, how that's different from asylum is that refugees, when we talk about refugee admissions, typically we're talking about a process that begins overseas, either in a country of first country of refuge. So think not necessarily Afghanistan, but a country in the region where somebody who needed safety may have fled to. And a process that begins and is sort of worked out before arriving in the United States. When we talk about asylum, typically we're talking about somebody who is also seeking safety and also fleeing from harm, but the process begins at the U.S. border or at a port of entry. Now, that's most of the time. There are exceptions in both situations, but those are the differences. A process that starts typically overseas versus a process that starts at the U.S. border or at a port of entry. So as we have kind of rapidly scaled up in the United States to welcome Afghans, there have been a few different needs that are critical, that are unique to this situation. One is because of the rapid emergency nature of this program, people are being what's called paroled into the United States, a mechanism called humanitarian parole. That allows the government to move quickly, through processing more quickly than they may otherwise be able to. But a lot of the sort of assurances that come with the refugee admissions program, are not a part of the parole process. So over the last several weeks, we and our peer organizations and advocates have worked very hard to make sure that refugees from Afghanistan receive some of the same services and benefits that refugees would typically receive when they enter the U.S. And we're continuing to work to make sure that Afghans have a way to adjust their status in the U.S. and have a way to become legal permanent residents. Right now, they don't, and the humanitarian parole process allows them to be in the United States, but there's some uncertainty about their status, and that's just not something that we think is acceptable. So we're continuing to push on that. We're also continuing to push to make improvements so that people who still want to leave Afghanistan, or maybe who left but are kind of in an uncertain situation in a third country, have a way that they can get to the United States. There's a program right now called the P2 program, which allows US affiliated people who maybe did not qualify for what's known as the SIV program, meaning maybe they didn't work directly for the United States government, but they still have strong US affiliations, or maybe they weren't able to get out as part of the evacuation. And this program would provide safety to people, but it needs to be structured in a way that it's accessible. So that's another thing we're working on.
Terrific, JC. Thank you so much. The first question that has come to us, I think, is pertinent to your reflections, and that is, talk about what we've learned from the temporary protective status issue. Why was the TPS created in the first place? Who is currently covered by TPS? How is it determined who can be protected? And perhaps most importantly, apropos of the Afghanistan matter, what did we learn from the TPS that can be applied moving forward?
So temporary protected status, TPS, is a mechanism that the government uses to recognize when it's simply not safe for somebody to return to their country of origin. And as a more permanent solution is worked out, they're temporarily protected in the United States. Currently, there is not a TPS for Afghanistan, though there certainly should be. And I think it's worth saying, earlier we touched on Haiti, and there is TPS for Haiti. But nevertheless, we saw horrific images a few weeks ago now of Haitians on the US southern border being expelled because of Title 42. So TPS is a tool, and it can be a good tool, but it's not perfect. And if it's not backed with the government really prioritizing a region for protection, it's only so good of a tool.
Perfect. Thank you, JC. Carolina, can you elaborate specifically on the matter of the Haitian crisis that we're seeing at the border? The paradox that while they're covered by TPS, yet we see the images that you refer to.
I mean, and you're totally right. I mean, why aren't Haitians being protected? I think it's important to acknowledge that, thousands of Haitians did start their immigration procedures in the US. Our concern is about those who were forcibly deported, and we're talking about The data is a bit confusing, but about 7,500 Haitians were sent back in a period of 12, 13 days on flights, which I consider to be an incredibly logistical, enterprise carried out very efficiently, as I was saying earlier, right, when it comes to enforcement. In the first place, we need to understand that in South America, in 2010, when the earthquake struck Haiti and, devastated an already fragile country, many Haitians went to Brazil and to Chile and other countries in South America to look for job opportunities, and they have stayed there since then. So many of the Haitians that are coming into the US right now are not necessarily coming from Haiti. Most of them are coming from Brazil and especially from Chile because of different things, because of TPS. TPS has been seen as a pull factor, right? And many people have perhaps received the wrong information about what to expect at the border. But Mexico and the US have been cooperating on enforcement against Haitians. So in the last, before that famous photograph that will remain in history and in our minds, we saw the same thing happening in Mexico. And unfortunately, I'm afraid we didn't get as much coverage as the other pictures did. So Mexico has been working as to deter migrants from reaching the US, and many Haitians were basically confined to the south of Mexico and they were not allowed to move north. Yet in mid-September, we saw that change, and many Haitian asylum seekers and migrants who were in Mexico were able to reach the US southern border. What is important here is that precisely because of the assistance of Title 42 and the lack of infrastructure, to deal with a changing reality in migration flows, the deterrence approach continues to be the preferred approach, and there isn't a real protection approach to deal, with a population that is in a very vulnerable situation. It's important to remember that people coming from Chile and from Brazil, and most of these Haitians come from there, have been traveling for between 1 and 3 months to reach the southern border. And they have crossed the so-called Darien Gap in Panama, which is a very, dense tropical jungle where it is known and it has been documented. People die crossing this jungle. Women and girls suffer sexual violence, and they are already, sadly, burying people in massive graves. So I think we are at a very, alarming. We're facing a very alarming scenario. UNICEF came out today and said that at least 19,000 children have crossed the Darien jungle this year, and half of them are children younger than 5. No child should have to cross the Darien jungle to reach safety. And sadly, we're seeing thousands of them coming with their parents and then being separated, some of them from their parents. So I think, as I said, a very difficult complex that requires a protection-driven solution.
Thank you, Carolina. Thank you. Apropos of your last point, 19,000 children, another dark chapter in the history of enforcement that shall live for a long time is the caging and the forced separation of children during the previous administration. A question we have from one of our audience member is, have all the children separated from their families at the US southern border under the previous administration been reunited with their families? What can you tell us about that? Either one of you, Carolina or JC.
The answer is no. there are hundreds of children that have not been reunited with their parents, especially because their parents were deported and the children remained in the US. I think in a positive move, the Biden administration did set up a task force and led by, very well-known immigration and human rights activists. So that's a move we welcome, but the task is enormous. You have children who don't know their address in their home country. You have parents that probably perished on their way back, that have tried to come back to the United States without success. So this is, I think this will be remembered as one of the cruelest policies we have witnessed in our region.
Thank you. JC, is there anything you want? This is the deterrence by terror. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think that covers it. It's these policies are, I think, one of several that the last administration held, with an intentional effort to diminish migration and to really atrophy the tools that the United States has to help refugees and asylum seekers. And I think we're still seeing the fallout from that, and it's taking time to rebuild these systems, and more can be done.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. You're both at the forefront of what I and others have called the catastrophic migrations of the 21st century. One of the questions that has come to us is, what is the one thing that Congress and the president can do today that will have a direct impact? JC, if the IRC could have one thing to prioritize, Carolina, if the Washington office in Latin America could have one thing to prioritize, what would that be?
IRC side, just speaking to refugee admissions, I would say Congress should pass legislation like the Grace Act, which would set a statutory floor for refugee admissions. So we wouldn't have to worry about these wild swings in admission goals that we've seen over the last several years. That legislation has been introduced. I think many of you may be happy to hear in the Senate, Senator Markey is the sponsor. But that is one area that would have an enormous impact on refugee admissions specifically.
Thank you, Carolina.
I would say end Title 42 and put your funding and your political capital into building the right infrastructure at the border to manage migration flows with, humane practices.
Terrific. Thank you so much. A question that I think would be very helpful to the two of you, and that comes from a member of the audience. How can we, ordinary citizens, assist in making a difference for our immigrant and for our refugees coming into our country today?
Let me first say that is a wonderful question, because it's our duty. It's everybody's. To defend human rights it should be everybody's task. I would say a few things. We need to educate policymakers into understanding that migration is not a toxic issue that they should avoid or that they should treat as something that they need to, look tough on. But to educate policymakers, we need to educate ourselves. So I think that's a very important thing to do. And I always invite, and I know that I believe many students are looking at us today, and it's always great when we see young people wanting to learn about this issue. We need to change the narrative of migration. We need to move away from that toxic issue that during elections, become even more relevant, to discussing migration from what it is, a human phenomenon that has been part of US history for years. We need to understand that in the middle of a pandemic, the so-called essential workers that, by the way, were essential workers before the pandemic, but it became more relevant, many of them were migrants. And when we were in our houses, having food on our table, having people deliver that food, having people working as clerks in supermarkets, in pharmacies, we had a lot of health workers, giving their best. Many of these people were immigrants. Let's take this opportunity to change the narrative, the toxic narrative that some have sadly promoted, into one that I think is much more close to American values.
Thank you so much, Caroline. I've been working in this field for 40 years, and I can say the following. We love immigrants looking backwards, but in the here and now, there's always anxiety, there's always concern. This was true 200 years ago, it was true 100 years ago, and it is true today. Benjamin Franklin thought it was a catastrophe that we were allowing German immigrants to come to our country. He famously said, they're going to Germanize us, we're never going to Anglicize them. Here we are, 2 centuries later, and we can see how risible that concern was. The fear, the panic, the moral anxiety over the arrival of large numbers of Eastern Europeans, large numbers of Irish and Mediterranean folk Catholics and Eastern European Jews generated another moral panic. And again, we look now backwards and we see how unfounded and misplaced those anxieties and concerns were. So maybe 100 years from now, we will look back at this moment and be able to say how misplaced so many of these concerns were. One question for Carolina from a member of the audience. Can you explain Title 42 in 3 sentences, please?
It's a public health order used by the Trump administration to expel people who come from countries where there is a disease. So during the pandemic, it was implemented by Trump at the border to protect public health. The problem is that, it ended up being implemented in a way that you expel everybody because there is a public health emergency. But when you look at it, many of these people are not, positive when it comes to COVID, so they shouldn't apply this public health order to them.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Another question, JC, maybe you can take the lead. Could you give examples of what humane practices at the southern border would look like? What are best practices? What are we learning? I mean, after all, we're not alone. Germany took over 1.4 million deeply traumatized Syrian refugees, and it's an example of how an organized, proactive, thought-through strategy can yield such positive returns. Today, 5 years later, the Syrian connectivity with the German labor market, which is a win-win for them, is over 85%. So talk to us about what would a humanitarian, a humane set of practices at the southern border look like?
Yeah, I think what it comes down to at the southern border, and Carolina spoke to this earlier, is having an approach that is protection forward and not enforcement forward. Currently, we have an enforcement system at the border, and an enforcement system that attempts to use tools like Title 42, to keep people out in sort of a blanket sense, rather than assessing whether somebody has a valid claim and is fleeing for safety. That's really I think how we need to flip this on its head. We need to make sure that people, have effectively their day in court, that their claim is heard, and that they're treated in a humane way and not criminalized as that process, kind of plays itself out. That I could go into a ton of detail about what that looks like, and the many changes that are needed to the asylum system to get there. But really, it's a question of ideology and how you think about protection and what we want our posture to be towards people who need safety.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have a lot of just wonderful questions, so I want to now give them to you, and if we can have pithy 3-sentence responses. Carolina, for you, under the humanitarian parole programs, in many or most cases, a sponsor is required to assume legal liability for financial support to allow immigration to proceed. For elderly and disabled Afghans, including family members of interpreters with SIVs, how can we humanely allow them into the US without such requirement? What would your response to that be? And then JC.
Well, I think JC probably is much more.
Okay, JC, you
crisis
than
than
that
I
one?
am. Yeah.
JC, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think one solution is categorical parole for Afghans with U.S. ties. So, whether you were able to get on an evacuation flight or not, whether you're in a third country or still in Afghanistan, if you have a verifiable U.S. tie, you should be granted parole. And what that would I think address the problem that the audience member raises, but it would also it would help give people some certainty about what their pathway is.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Carolina, this is for you. You're in Washington, not the most bipartisan city these days. The question is, what are viables? What are 3 things you would like to see in order to, and I'm quoting from our audience member, in order to persuade the other party to support immigration, more humane immigration interventions and reforms?
Well, I think one thing is that, when you look at Dreamers, for example, or TPS holders, the business community supports TPS and supports Dreamers, and it always has, because, especially TPS holders who have been in the US for many years, many of them are entrepreneurs, they're parents of US citizens, etc. And the same goes with Dreamers, they're students, they're hard workers, etc. So there is an economic benefit to the presence of immigrants in the US, and understanding that dynamic is important. And I think it's always an entry point to persuade, policymakers who tend to be, or lawmakers in this case, tend to be anti-migrant. I think a second thing is indeed talking about what you were talking about, Marcelo, at the beginning. The history of the US is a history of immigration, and to have moved from that very strong value of embracing immigrants at different moments of history to having immigration being part of a toxic debate has not been positive for the country. On the contrary, it's been an issue that has divided the US and has even, turned neighbors against neighbors, and we see that in mixed communities where tensions that did not exist before exist nowadays. So I think changing the narrative I was saying, and making sure that the policymakers who are, unfortunately, promoting this type of toxic speech understand that their words matter and that they need to be held accountable for what they're doing and what they're saying and promoting.
Thank you so much, Carolina. I have to say that the Nobel Prize in Economics yesterday went to a UC Berkeley economist, David Carr, who has written extensively on the matter of the impact of immigrants on the wages and on the general fiscal and otherwise economic implications of large-scale migration. And the work of Dr. Card, again, our most recent winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, the National Research Council in the study to end all studies on the matter. The data are in. The preponderance of evidence suggests that immigrants are a net surplus to the US economy, and in certain domains, They have made transformational improvements. I mean, geologic force in the U.S. Economy. Think from the origin of the computer, it was an immigrant from Hungary, to the first bypass operation, it was an immigrant from Latin America, to the ways that you use to find your way in Boston, in LA, or in Washington, DC. This is all products of immigrants that have made enormous contributions to the US economy. I'm mindful of time, so what I'd like to do is a very, very quick answer. How realistic is it that the US and Mexico will or could invest in development strategies in Central America and Haiti to address the issues, Carolina, of the sources of immigration? One sentence from each of you.
Totally realistic. It has done so in the past, but the problem is not just the amount of investment, but the quality of the investment. So we truly believe that investing in development and investing to address the root causes is a good strategy, but it needs to be a strategy based on this country's needs and on what really makes a difference, and not rather just what the US thinks makes a difference. So, you know, real collaboration and strategic partnerships with actors in the region can totally make a difference.
Terrific. Thank you so much, JC. I assume you're going to say that what we did in Afghanistan is not what we need to be doing.
I was actually just going to say I couldn't have said it better than Carolina in terms of the region, but so I think I'll leave it at that.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I would like you to, we are mindful of the time. We're coming to a close of our program. I would like to give you, Carolina and JC, a chance to offer any final thoughts, any takeaways. What would you like our audience, who would send them just wonderful, wonderful questions, to take away from this workshop?
I would say, take away the title of this panel. Getting to the point, you know, implies, in our view, discussing migration and refugees always through the lenses of human rights. Why? Because our dignity, right, as human beings, can only be fulfilled and protected when the policies that affect our life are also policies sought and implemented with the rights framework at the forefront.
JZ, thank you. JZ.
I would just say, you know, for anybody listening who wants to do more and wants to help, you know, there are resettlement offices across the country who are looking for volunteers, who are looking for, you know, for donations. You know, so take a look at our website, do a Google search. And if you want to take action, you know, and reach out to your elected leaders. There's you know, all kinds of things out there too, talking about the full spectrum of issues we mentioned today.
Terrific. Thank you so much. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Thank you to the members of the audience for their engagement and their very, very thoughtful and on-point questions. Indeed, as we promised, we got to the point on immigration and refugees, a topic that is so central to the nature of our history, and as Carolina reminded us, so significant to the cause of a more humanitarian at a time when the practice of democratic citizenship is so under siege, and it is the case that immigration, myths about immigration, misconceptions about immigration continue to be a point of reference. At a time when the political class speaks to the reptilian centers of the brain when it comes to immigration, we need clearly argued, fact-based, humane-based discourse on this transcendental point in the history of our country. So thank you so much. Muchas, muchas gracias. A very, very wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you very much.